All right, hi everybody. Welcome back to the history stuff I do at 1 o'clock on Thursdays, which was initially designed to mimic the idea of a course. And I know people get confused because I do the politics one at 4 o'clock on Tuesday. That was kind of to lead into the evening news and to give people two kinds of times that they could actually tune into the stuff that I do. Because that's the first time I did this, people asked to have a couple of options. So, excuse me. So that's why they're at two separate times. Anyway, this is the talk where I'm trying to walk people through American history from the beginning until yesterday, loosely following along the book I just came out with called How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America, I believe is the word there. So what I want to do today is take us from Ronald Reagan to the present. But I was looking over the stuff today and I decided I really want to kick the real present, Donald Trump and the backlash to Donald Trump, into a talk for next week. I don't want to wrap the whole thing up today because I think that really deserves more time than I can give it in the 15 minutes that I would otherwise allot to it. So today I'm just going to take you up through the cementing in power of the movement conservative narrative that I've talked about for the last week or so, pretty much last week. So that being said, a couple of disclaimers. First, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I study American politics and economics primarily. But when I do these talks, I'm not speaking for my employer. This is on my own time, and my employer is not responsible for anything I say here. All right, so where I left, oh, by the way, this is really off the cuff because my grades went in less than an hour ago. So the end of a semester is always really, really rough for college professors because, you know, we're really wrapping up the whole year. And this year was particularly unusual because of the fact we ended up being distance learning. And so there was a lot that went on. So we'll see how this turns out. So what I have tried to argue throughout the course of these lectures on Thursdays is that America was formed on this paradox, on the idea that American equality, the concept that all men are created equal, depended on the idea that not everybody was included in that. The founders excluded women, of course, across the board because they believed that women were inferior to men just by nature of how they were made by God in their minds. And they excluded people of color, African Americans, Africans, at first Afro-Caribbeans, and also African Americans. And then, of course, the native populations with whom they came in contact. And they enslaved, of course, people of color from the very beginning. So this whole ringing concept, this really exciting, important, revolutionary concept that all men are created equal, and though that is a revolutionary and an important concept even today, that revolutionary concept depended on this old hierarchical idea that in fact not everybody was included in that. So what I've been trying to argue is that that image of equality is depending on people who remaining unequal has enabled oligarchs to take over our society by weaponizing that idea, if you will, by using what I've called a corollary to that paradox to say, wait a minute, if women and people of color approach equality, that will mean that you people, those people who used to control society, will no longer be equal. Because you will lose your liberty to do what you want and to spend your money the way you want, and therefore you will inherently become equal. The liberty on which your equality depends will be lost, and therefore women and people of color approaching equality means inequality for the people who previously controlled society. It's a kind of complicated idea, but I think it really works. And today and then next week I'll talk about, well, first today I'll talk about how that got put into place, how that weaponization took place from the 1980s to the present. And then next week, I'd like to talk a little bit about how that how that gave us Donald Trump in the presidency and the people surrounding him, because it's not just about him, and how there's been a backlash to that as well. All right, so let's start where I left last week, which is with Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is just a fascinating character in ever so many ways. But he's a fascinating character, not least because of the fact that under Reagan, we get the enactment of the concept that the movement conservatives had been pushing since the 1950s. And that is the idea that what they really want to do is dismantle the New Deal government that regulates business, provides a basic social safety net, and promotes infrastructure. Because again, they're weaponizing that idea that if in fact you use the government to level the playing field so that businesses can't do anything they want, for example, and can't abuse their workers, that infringes on the liberty of the men who run those businesses, and therefore it creates what they're calling socialism or communism in this period. It destroys American equality. And it's interesting because Reagan really talks that line, and his policies put in place that line, but he actually governs much more moderately than he talks about, which is one of the reasons Reagan is so fascinating, is because you can get anything you want out of Ronald Reagan. If you follow what he says, you say, oh, he's a movement, dyed-in-the-wool movement conservative. If you follow the way he governs, including raising taxes, you can say, oh, he's much more moderate than that, which is why Ronald Reagan always appears on every side of every argument these days, is because you can pretty much do anything with his legacy, depending on whether you're looking at what he says or what he does. And as you know, I'm a real believer in listening to what people say, because that's how they shape reality, but by watching what they do. Anyway, so what happens is Ronald Reagan gets elected with this idea that we need to get rid of the New Deal, to go back and get rid of the government that is, as he says, determining people's lives from some distant, far off capital. And the first thing he does, he puts into his into office as his budget director a guy named David Stockman. And Stockman, by the way, is still active on Twitter. Stockman at the time was 35. He was a congressman from Michigan, and he was a huge fan of Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative that I talked about last week, the document that was ghostwritten by William F. Buckley Jr.'s brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell. And that was the one that basically said we need to get rid of the New Deal and get back to the idea of I'm sorry, I thought somebody was talking about this here too. They're talking about something else to me. I'm paranoid having broadcast twice on the wrong channel. They're talking about getting back to a world before the New Deal. They want to get rid of what they consider unconstitutional infringement on the liberty, as I say, of business people to do what they want to do, and that is written up in the Conscience of a Conservative. That's ghost written by L. Brent Bozell. It's over Barry Goldwater's name, and that's why you know it that way. It's the Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. It's actually ghost written by William F. Buckley Jr.'s brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell. Anyway, Stockman had grown up on this book, and he really loved this idea. So as soon as he takes office, Reagan begins to propose cutting the previous year's budget, and he wants to cut $47 billion from it. And Stockman sets out to do that, and he sets out to do that in exactly how you would expect. He proposes cutting funding for food stamps, education, job training, unemployment insurance, all those New Deal type programs that the movement conservatives think is an infringement on the liberties of the people paying the taxes, or having to support the bureaucracy that puts in place these policies, or that whose rights are infringed upon, they think, by business regulation. But what's interesting about Stockman and what happens in this first year of what's happening with the Reagan budget is that the whole idea, of course, behind the idea of slashing taxes, which is how Reagan gets elected, is the idea that that by slashing taxes, what you will do is you'll promote growth such that it will actually increase federal revenues. And this is the idea that that George H.W. Bush calls voodoo economics, the idea that by cutting taxes you can actually increase revenue. But they believe that it's going to happen. So Stockman puts all his numbers into the computers at the Office of Management and Budget, and the computers actually spit back that, in fact, the proposed tax cuts are going to decrease revenues dramatically and explode the deficit. And when that happens, Stockman simply reprograms the computers. He doesn't say we got a problem. He says, we'll change the computers. And he rationalized this by saying to a reporter, he actually held a number of lunch meetings with a reporter and talked a lot about what they were doing, which is just a gold mine for historians. He said, quote, "None of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers. The whole thing is premised on faith, on a belief about how the world works." And that's sort of been my contention about the movement conservatives in all my writings about them, is that they're not really operating in reality. They are operating ideologically on a belief about the way the world works. And this, as I keep harping on, is the antithesis of conservatism. It's exactly what Edmund Burke worried about when he was looking at the French Revolution. He said, you can't govern according to ideology. You have to govern boots on the ground, because ideology is going to lead you into ridiculous cul-de-sacs. And he, of course, was looking at the French Revolution, but the same, I think, can be said here about the movement conservatives. So their faith, of course, was that if you put money at the top of society, those leaders in society would know how to create jobs, would know how to make the economy thrive, and would be the ones who would bring prosperity to everybody. A rising tide lifts all boats. And this is the same theory, of course, that the Republicans were advocating in the 1920s under Coolidge and Harding, and in the 1890s, in the era of the robber barons, and of course that the Democrats were advocating in the 1850s with the elite slave owners, that they were really the ones who should be controlling society because they're really the ones who understood how it worked. So what happens is that Reagan goes ahead and he sells this by saying, you know, I'm defending taxpayers, I'm defending the little guy. And even still, he doesn't get a lot of traction on that. He proposes a really sweeping tax cut, and it doesn't really go anywhere because a lot of people are like, this is voodoo economics. And this is where Hinckley's attempted assassination of Reagan comes into play, those of you who remember it. Reagan was portrayed in the media after that assassination attempt as being genial and welcoming to everybody and funny, and his popularity really, really increases. Now, interestingly enough, that is kind of a media trope, that when any leader gets an attempt is made on a leader's life, all of a sudden nobody wants to say, well, we don't care, he was a jerk anyway. And I'm exaggerating here. The media always portrays him as joking and happy and being friendly around people. That's kind of just the trope, the way it is. But nonetheless, the first thing that Reagan does after he recovers from what was really a very serious attempt on his life is he tells Congress, please pass my tax cut. And they do it. And that's so it's a really interesting thing about thinking about how Hinckley fit into the larger story of American life. So anyway, tax cuts then become part of Republican orthodoxy, because what happens is that immediately as Reagan takes office, there is this enormous recession, and for a number of reasons. But the economy begins to recover in 1983, and it does so for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with tax cuts. It does so, first of all, because those oil prices that have crippled the 1970s begin to drop dramatically. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve Board slashes the interest rates that were so high in the 1970s. And then finally, perhaps most important, Congress was pouring money into the military. It increased the military budget by $17 billion in 1982. That was 40% in real spending. So this is essentially deficit spending. They're essentially doing a New Deal, but rather than doing it for education and roads and all that, they're doing it by pouring money into the military. And that, coupled with the tax cuts, creates this boom. Congress also deregulates the savings and loan industry, which pumps about $160 billion more into the economy. So what you have is enormous deficit spending. And even though that deficit spending is going to have to be repaid, that's not the way it plays in the media. People look at this and they say, oh, wow, the tax cuts worked. This is great. The tax cuts works. Tax cuts really are creating this booming economy. And when Democrats are horrified by this and are trying to sort of plug the holes in what is this enormous investment in the economy through deficit spending, this is where Grover Norquist comes into play. Norquist is a lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce. He's never held elective office, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And he keeps saying to politicians that voters do not want to be taxed to pay down deficits. They simply want to continue to spend money and to rely on the Republican promise that those tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. And you hear that again and again and again. Tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. All right. So there is again a number. I'm sorry. So you get this idea that the tax cuts are paying for themselves. And in 1986, there's a really important new move. And that 1986 move is that Reagan goes to go for his real meaty tax cut, the 1986 tax cut. And that does a number of things. It actually relieves about 6 million lower income people from paying income taxes at all. And this is where you now get the argument, well, they don't pay taxes. Of course, everybody pays taxes. This is only about income taxes. But it also cuts the capital gains tax. It cuts the marginal tax rate. from 50% to 20%, and marginal taxes are, of course, are the amount you pay on the upper level of your income. But those marginal tax rates go from 50 to 28%, and it also cuts the corporate tax rate dramatically from 48% to 34%. And when Democrats start to look at this and say, wait a minute, the most tax relief in this goes to 0.5% of the richest Americans, Republicans retort that anybody who wants higher taxes on people at the top are simply trying to run what Bob Packwood from Oregon calls social welfare schemes. And this is when Phyllis Schlafly steps up and says, you know, anybody who's trying, for example, to put into the tax bill things that protect low-income families are actually anti-family. Because anything that is anti-growth is anti-family. So pro-growth is pro-family by definition. So that's how you can explain away what seems to be this weird thing where you're saying we want to put stuff that's going to help families in the tax bill, and people like Phil Schlafly are saying, no, we're pro-family, and we're saying you're anti-family for wanting to do that. Well, their larger argument is if you improve the economy for everybody, by definition, that's going to improve it for all families. So the problem, I'm sorry, this is not, I shouldn't say it's a problem yet. This for Reagan has religious implications, and it has international implications. That is, if the American system is the best for everybody, of course Americans should export it overseas. And in 1983, he begins to talk about a foreign policy called the Reagan Doctrine, which calls not simply for holding back communism, but for rolling it back. And this is how we start to invest in, we Americans start to invest in the freedom fighters, for example, in Nicaragua, in Angola, and in Afghanistan. This is how we end up supporting, for example, the Mujahideen, because we're trying to push back what Reagan considers communism, because he says that we are engaged in a battle between, quote, right and wrong and good and evil, and that the communism is run by the Russian by the USSR is the evil empire that it is trying to take over the world, and America is standing for good and pushing that back. But the problem with this at home is that in 1986, it's not at all clear that people are behind this tax cut idea, because they're looking at the destruction of programs that they really liked, and they're not thinking that this is such a great idea. So in order to preserve these tax cuts, there's some major changes in the Republican coalition, and the most important in 86 is that Reagan backs Grover Norquist's attempt to organize business leaders and social conservatives and evangelicals into a political juggernaut. And this is where we get Americans for Tax Reform. And the idea is that business organizations will provide the money, the resources, to organize evangelicals and social conservatives to get the votes. And this organization in 86 is going to be instrumental in cementing the coalition that's going to really take over in the 1990s. All right, so this coalition by 1986 and in 1986 is strong enough to overpower the traditional Republicans that are still in the Republican Party. So a lot of people write to me and say, I've been a Republican all my life. I don't recognize this party. What happened? And what happened is right here in 1986. What happened is with this new coalition that mobilizes evangelicals and social conservatives who previously had not really been politically involved, this new wing, the movement conservative wing of the Republican Party, manages to take over the party itself and to push out traditional Republicans. And this is really led by Grover Norquist as well, but Newt Gingrich of Georgia, who vows to harry out of the Republican Party people he calls Republicans in name only, or rhinos. And the beauty of that phrase is that, of course, Newt Gingrich and the movement conservatives are Republicans in name only. They're not traditional Republicans. They're this radical group coming in and trying to take over the traditional Republican Party, but by labeling the traditional Republicans, the ones who have been there since Eisenhower, as the ones who are not real Republicans, they talk about purging them from the Republican Party. And this is when we get the 1990s purges of the rhinos from the Republican Party. They also, under Norquist, Grover Norquist, they get members of Congress to sign this anti-tax pledge, which says that they will not raise taxes under any circumstances for any reason, and that if you don't do that, that they're going to primary you. That is, they're going to find somebody who will promise that to take you out in the Republican primary. Now, interestingly enough, political scientists think that primarying was not really a thing, but the fear of it was a big thing. And so they managed to continue to move the Republican Party from its traditional base into this movement Republican camp. The way this plays out is, of course, that, and I'll talk more about this in a second because I'm trying to organize things today, first in how the policies of the movement conservatives under Reagan and the Republican presidents who followed him move money upward, but then I want to talk about how they sell that. So I'm dividing things up a little bit. And then finally, I want to talk about how they manipulated the voting base to make sure that that image became American orthodoxy. All right, so what I want to do here then is talk about how this plays out in terms of money and in terms of the Republican Party. Well, George H.W. Bush is elected after he's the vice president to Ronald Reagan, and after Reagan's term, Bush is elected, and he's got this huge problem on his hands because the deregulation of the savings and loan banks has made them collapse, and he's got somehow to bail them out. And at the same time, they've got these the budget deficits that Reagan has run, these huge deficits, have just blown a hole through the American budget, and it has also tripled the federal debt. The federal debt, which is the long-term obligations of the United States government as opposed to the deficit, which is a yearly calculation, that has tripled during Reagan's term. So he's got to do something, and one of the things that he decides to do is to raise taxes. And if you remember, he had been elected with the famous statement, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But of course he has to eat that, and he has to say, we've got to do something about these deficits. And so he raises taxes, and Newt Gingrich signs on to that in private, but in public, he instantly goes up in front of the cameras and says, oh, he is destroying Reagan's legacy. He is not a real Republican. And Bush actually went to Gingrich and said, you're killing us. You're just killing us. And of course, that was the point. Gingrich was trying to kill off traditional Republicans like George H.W. Bush in order to destroy the federal government that George H.W. Bush still believed in, even though he wanted to trim it quite a bit. All right, so Norquist and Gingrich worked together in the 1994 midterms. They were determined really to push their idea, and of destroying the traditional republicanism and taking over the party. And they were backed by the Republican National Committee, which poured a lot of money into House races. And this was the period when they gave us their contract with America. And they promised with that if they were given control of Congress, because Congress was Democratic at the time, Republicans on their first day would audit Congress, they would cut a third of House committees and their staff, and they would pass a requirement that it would take 3/4 of a majority in Congress to pass a tax increase. And that they would then continue for the next 99 days to a mirror of FDR's 100 days to go ahead and push the movement conservative platform as far as they possibly could. And it worked. Voters actually put them in power in 1994 for the first time since 1954 under Eisenhower. And this was going to be the start of this great new Republican era when they dismantled the New Deal. And Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker of the House. Interestingly enough, as soon as he's Speaker of the House, the first thing that the Gingrich Republicans do, and by the way, the literature on this in the newspapers at the time was fascinating. It was because they're so giddy, they're talking to anybody. And one of the things they do is they make Rush Limbaugh an honorary member of that incoming congressional class. And Rush Limbaugh instantly goes into the newspapers and says, well, the first things the Republicans have to do is they have to dismantle the welfare system because the welfare system is shredding the social fabric. He says it's gutting the work ethic, it's gutting educational performance, it's gutting the moral discipline of the poor. And then they had to cut capital gains taxes to drive economic growth, he said, because this would produce billions of dollars of revenue, it would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. And the whole plan, as Norquist said, was to defund the federal government. And as you know, probably the phrase, and drown it in the bathtub. So you can see here the coming together in '94 of this idea of actually getting rid of the federal government and the help for people at the bottom, and having capital gains tax cuts and all that to move money upward, because those are the people who really understand how society works. And this is, there is an ideology behind this. It's not just, hey, it's good for me, although obviously it's good for them. They really believe, I think, that there's an ideology here that says this is the way society works best, because if you let people at the bottom control the way our government works, they're going to take our money and they're going to waste it, and the economy is going to crash, and everybody is, if a rising tide lifts all boats, a sinking tide sinks all boats. And that is the ideology behind this argument. Well, eventually, as you know, the contract with America is completely forgotten. They're not able to do anything they intend to do. By then, you've got Bill Clinton in power. He's not going to sign off on any of this. But the contract with America is something that's very, very important. And that's that, in fact, because he is in charge of Congress, Gingrich is able to slash the budgets for congressional staff. And with those slashing of budgets for congressional staff, the research and the writing of congressional legislation passes from congressional staffers to lobbyists, because they're the only, the Congress critters don't have any idea really about the ins and outs of, some law having to do with migratory birds or something. So normally they would have turned to a staff, but now they turn to lobbyists to do that, because they'll say, oh wait, what is really the best for everybody is to do this. That changes then. There is also the fact that that Gingrich actually and his people actually go to lobbyists, and they say, you've been working with Democrats now since 1954, you better start working with us. And this is known as the K Street Project, to actually bring lobbyists and the Republican Party closer together. All right, so of course this doesn't work, as we know from every chart. Money moves upward beginning in 1981, and it keeps moving upward through all this period. And in fact, for all the talk about how well it's doing for the American economy, in fact, it's doing very, very well for people at the very top. It's doing really poorly for people as you go on down, and it's especially hitting people of color and women, of course. So that, for example, in let me see if I can get some numbers here for you. In let me see. By 2015, the top 1% of American families are taking home more than 20% of income, and the families in the top 1%, if you're looking at wealth, owned as much wealth as the families in the bottom 90%. So this system is not working for everybody the way it's supposed to. It's working for people at the top. All right, so how do you sell this? And this, to me, is the really interesting part. How do you sell this when people know their lives are getting worse and not better? It's really clear, and people are not living in some illusion that things are getting better. They're having to borrow money. You have to have two family incomes, both parents and a house working in order to make ends meet in a way that you didn't have to in the 1970s. Their real wages are getting hollowed out. The cuts in taxes are not helping them. If the federal taxes are declining, they're getting put on at the state and local level, either in taxes or in fees, because of things that are no longer covered. People aren't stupid. They see this. So how do you combat that? And this is what fascinates me, because the way that the Republicans did this, and again, I keep saying Republicans because they do run the party after the 1990s, these movement conservative Republicans. But as a scholar of the Republican Party, I really want to emphasize that this is not the traditional Republican Party. This is a group that has taken over that party. So my listeners who are still identify with the Republican Party, with the Eisenhower Party, you're right to say your party left you. And someday I would love to talk about the parties themselves and what they actually stand for, because they have very different ideologies. And we need both of their ideologies, their traditional ideologies, by the way. But there's a reason that you think this is the case. So I'm going to keep on using the word Republican because these movement conservatives by the 1990s have taken over the party. But that's not an excoriation of the Republican Party in general. It's an excoriation of this group that took over the Republican Party, if that's helpful at all. I can see how it might be or not. Anyway, so how do you sell this? You sell this by going back to that original American paradox, that the idea that what is really great about America is that individual who can make it on his own, that person who's equal, but all he wants is an equal shot, and that he is being held back by people of color and women who are trying to hold him back, who are trying to take his money, who are trying to hem him in. And before the Civil War, that image was of the yeoman farmer, for example. But remember Reconstruction, when that became associated with the American cowboy. And if you think about the rise of this idea in the 1980s and the 1990s, you will remember the extraordinary emphasis of the Westerner, the American cowboy. And obviously Reagan played with that. I talked about that last week, but other presidents played with that as well too. In fact, it becomes a theme in the 1980s and the 1990s. So what does this actually mean? If you think about it, they're really pulling back to this idea of the Westerner, the independent cowboy, who is just trying to get away from the federal government. He's just trying to do stuff on his own, so that his tax dollars are not taken by the government to feed this bureaucracy that is creating communism or socialism back east. If you remember during the Reconstruction period I talked about, that's really when Southern Democrats and Westerners developed the idea that a government that was trying to level the playing field between African Americans and white Americans, men in that case, was in fact a form of communism or socialism, because the bureaucracy that would required tax dollars. And that meant that hardworking white taxpayers would have to cough up the money to level the playing field for people of color. And that argument gained traction in the 1870s. I talked about that, but it gets reborn again in the 1950s with the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954, and with Eisenhower sending the troops into Little Rock in 1957, when people like William F. Buckley Jr. in National Review say, we told you this New Deal government was simply going to redistribute wealth from hardworking white people to grasping African Americans. And that's going to get expanded, of course, under Nixon to include a number of groups of people of color who are demanding equal rights in American society. Mexican Americans and Chicanos, for example, American Indians, women, feminists, and that's really going to take off in this new period of American political ideology. And of course, this starts with Reagan, who's this master of political anecdote telling. You know, he's got the image of the welfare queen I talked about last week, this woman who is, he says, stereotypical. She has, you know, a whole bunch of she's getting payments from the government for non-existent husbands and Social Security checks and all kinds of stuff, and she has 6 Cadillacs, and, you know, I don't remember all the details, but it was a picture of a grasping African-American woman. He never specifically identifies her as black, but he repeatedly says she's from the South Side of Chicago, which is code word for she's black, and she's a woman, of course, and she is, you know, a leech. She's living off of hardworking taxpayers, the Archie Bunkers of the world, if you will. And he really pushes that, but he's not the only one. This image of the individual American standing against communism at home, really comes into popular culture in 1984 with the original movie Red Dawn by John Milius. And that's a really touchstone movie. And probably some of you are rolling your eyes, but it's a really touchstone movie, because the story behind it is the story of these high school football players in Colorado whose town is invaded by communists, and they are the only ones who stand against them, because the town's mayor and his son sell out to the communists. So these guys from the football team, the Wolverines, are going to, it's going to matter in a minute, are fighting off this communist invasion. And Reagan's first Secretary of State, Al Haig, actually advised that movie and then made sure that it was shown in the White House. And the reason that I emphasized the name of that is because when the guy who picked the name for the operation that captured Saddam Hussein in 2003 named that operation Red Dawn. And his argument for that was, I think all of us in the military have seen Red Dawn. and they actually divided up some of the other names of that movie for some of the pieces of that operation. So it was a really, really important movie. And what happened after that was that that it was really, first of all, the military recognizes that it's a great recruiting tool, and that's when you're going to get 2 years later you're going to get the production of Top Gun. And if you've wondered, the movie Top Gun, and if you've ever wondered why Top Gun looks so real, it's because those planes and stuff in that movie are real. They were working with the military on that film, and there's a long, great history of the relationship between the military and film. And I really can't go into that and how that has played out, but obviously it has played out hugely. But recognizing the importance of this narrative, the people who are pushing this idea of destroying the New Deal, the movement conservatives, launch an attack on what we know as the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine was a doctrine in play in America since the 1920s, in which government, any stations, any media stations, it began with radio, any media stations that had government licensing had to be fair. They had to present factual arguments, and if they got too far out on a limb in one direction, they had to let somebody else present the other side. This is where you get Gilda Radner on Saturday Night Live always running in with her sheaf of papers, saying that she wants to give the opposite viewpoint as Rosanna Dana. That's what she's doing. That was during the era of the Fairness Doctrine, and she had the right to do that if she went too far out if she felt Saturday Night Live went too far out in one direction. So, for example, when they take a stand against euthanasia, she comes out and defends youth in Asia. And that's the play that they were playing with. They were playing with the Fairness Doctrine there. But under Reagan put some new people on the Federal Communications Commission, and they get rid of that doctrine. And they get rid of that doctrine because movement conservatives have been saying this is destroying our ability to rally voters, because they won't let, it doesn't permit us to tell our people what we want them to know, because we're not actually basing our arguments in fact, and we're not getting fair time on radio stations and on TV because they're insisting that we actually have facts to back up our arguments. And this is how, by the way, I'll forget to talk about this in the future, this is how you can argue that Fox News is fair and balanced, because it is providing that ideological news that other media, which promptly got called by movement conservatives the liberal media, which was everybody, by the way, except them. That's how they can say that they're fair and balanced, because they're providing the news that the fact-based news will not provide. So that's why they're fair and balanced, is they're providing this news. All right, I'll tell you more about that in a minute if I remember. Isn't this stuff cool? All right. I mean, aside from the fact it's about our lives. Sorry. All right. So as soon as you get rid of the Fairness Doctrine, you can have things like Rush Limbaugh talking about this narrative of how socialism is creeping through America, and identifying the enemy as people of color and women, and people he calls feminazis, and these what they used to call the L-word liberals, these bad guys who are snaking socialism through America. And the message worked. If you remember when in 1988, when Michael Dukakis was running against George H.W. Bush for president, he was running 18 points ahead of Bush in the summer before that election. And that's when George H.W. Bush rolls out the Willie Horton ads, which are the ones it gets cut to be a second one, which is a complete, it just completely plays into this narrative that Dukakis, a Democrat, has enabled African-American predators to kill white people and literally to take their lives, not just their money, but their lives. And it's one of those things that was a narrative in that, yes, it's true that under Dukakis, Willie Horton was a murderer who was paroled. That happened under Dukakis, but it was actually his Republican predecessor who put the law in place. And the most lenient terms of parole in the country were actually under the federal program that had been put in place by Ronald Reagan. So yes, that did happen on the Democratic candidate Dukakis's watch, but it was a Republican program that had been put in place by Republicans. Nonetheless, that tanked Dukakis's candidacy. George H.W. Bush wins, and later the person who is responsible for that ad at his deathbed apologized for it. He said, we did this deliberately. We were playing on race here, and it worked. He apologized for a lot, but it was a little bit too late at that point. Anyway, so by that point, Americans have come around so thoroughly to the idea that these special interests are killing the ability of individualist white men to provide for their families by taking their tax dollars, for example, or by hemming them in, that when Michael Dukakis, and I love this thing, when Michael Dukakis nominates or taps Geraldine Ferraro to be his running mate. She's actually a really hot ticket. She's a really high-powered New York congresswoman, really knows her stuff. Nonetheless, most Americans, I believe the numbers are in the 60%, 60% of Americans said she's really not qualified for the job. He's only doing it to cater to a special interest. Because at that point, any woman or person of color could not be seen as somebody who was actually a legitimate actor. They had been reclassified as this other who was trying to take on and destroy American individualism. This then bleeds into the rise of militia movements, for example, people who have grown up on Red Dawn or have seen Red Dawn. And that also bleeds into this hugely best-selling book that a lot of people haven't heard of, a book from 1981 by Francis Schaeffer called A Christian Manifesto, in which he argues that America is a Christian nation and it's been corrupted by secularism. And as a Christian nation, the family, or as a Christian family, the nation should mirror the family, and the family therefore should be headed by one individual, by a God sort of figure, if you will. So by the 1980s, you start to get a lot of Christian homeschooling and a lot of Christians backing away from mainstream American society and ending up in enclaves where they're trying to reproduce what they believe is this individualistic religious society. And of course, this then is going to bleed back into politics in August of 1992 at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, when a factory worker who has done precisely this, a guy named Randy Weaver, has moved from the east out to northern Idaho to escape the corruption of American society. He doesn't show up to a court date on a trial for a firearms charge. And when that happens, federal marshals try to arrest him. He refuses to come. There's a firefight that kills his 14-year-old son and one of the deputy marshals. His wife is shot later on in an 11-day siege. And while this is going on, neo-Nazis and alt-right people who are nearby at their own compound, an Aryan Nations compound, swarm to Ruby Ridge to try and defend Weaver. And they interpret him as sort of a modern-day Jesse James, if you will, despite the fact that that he didn't show up to court for a firearms charge, which, you know, you're supposed to obey the laws. They see him as somebody persecuted by the federal government, and this really starts this modern day militia movement in play. The idea that the individuals have to arm themselves to hold off the federal government so they can have their individualistic patriarchal families. And this plays out the next year, of course, in Waco, Texas in April, when under Bill Clinton, officers and his Attorney General Janet Reno, a woman, by the way, one who doesn't naturally fall into that idea of a woman being protected by a patriarch. That's going to matter in just a minute. Under Janet Reno, officers storm the compound of a religious cult, and they do that. It's run by David Koresh, and they do that because former members have left the cult and have warned authorities that he's stockpiling weapons. So they try and go in, and there's a 51-day siege in which Koresh is reported as sexually abusing children and doing all kinds of things that that one normally would not think should be supported. In the end of the siege, there's a gun battle and a fire that kills 76 people. And that siege ends on April 19th, 1993. Now, just for the record here, a Republican congressional committee looked into this and concluded that there was, quote, overwhelming evidence, unquote, that the government under Bill Clinton, a Democrat, should be exonerated, that it had done what it should have done. Nonetheless, Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones, this is when he gets involved in talk radio, insist that the federal government has invaded Waco and has murdered American citizens who were simply Christians trying to take care of their families. And they point again and again and again to Janet Reno as this sort of manly, unnatural woman, a theme that's going to get picked up by Ted Nugent. And Ted Nugent, for years, is going to run on his stage shows a set piece that attacks Janet Reno, very obscenely, by the way. If you decide to watch this on YouTube, which I don't recommend, you probably don't want your children watching it. It's very graphic. And he shows this to his song, Kiss My Glock, in which he is talking about how good American men are going to hold off the federal government. This, of course, inspires Timothy McVeigh, who goes on to say, he comes home from being in the war and says, taxes are a joke. More taxes are always the answer to government mismanagement. Is a civil war imminent? Do we have to shed blood to reform the current system? I hope it doesn't come to that, but it might. And on April 19th, the date he chose to look back to Waco of 1995, he set off that bomb in Oklahoma City at the Murrah Federal Building that killed 168 people, including 19 children, babies under 6, and wounded more than 800 people. Crucially, for a historian, when the police capture him, he's wearing a T-shirt with a picture of Abraham Lincoln on it and the words "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which is what John Wilkes Booth said when he assassinated Lincoln, saying, "Thus always to tyrants." It's the motto of Virginia. Again, a harking back here to that ideology of the Confederacy. So in the heels of this, the Republicans don't back off. To the contrary, they up their game. So a political action committee that answers to Newt Gingrich actually gives out a list of words that new congressmen and people should use when they refer to Democrats versus Republicans. And when they refer to Democrats, they're supposed to use words like pathetic, liberal, and traitor. And when they refer to Republicans, they're supposed to use words like winning, prosperity, American, all the positive values. And this, of course, is going to be really the hallmark of the Fox News Channel. And the Fox News Channel, which begins in 1996, is really an attempt to bring this ideological position to the screen. If you think of the Fox News Channel, it looks like news. Those sets look like news, but as I keep harping on, it is not a news channel. It says in its terms of use that it is for entertainment purposes. Now, that's not true of the reporters on Fox News. There are real reporters. Shep Smith was one. Chris Wallace is another. They're people who actually check their facts, and yeah, they put a conservative spin on them, but they fact check, and they are trying to present the news in the way that they see it. They're real reporters, as opposed to the entertainment side, which is all the people you know of, Laura Ingraham, Jeanine Pirro, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly in his day, people who are simply entertaining you with this beautiful narrative of strong men and subordinate, beautiful women. And that was a really deliberate attempt on the part of Roger Ailes, it's Rupert Murdoch who funds Fox News, but it's produced by Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes, who you may have remembered from the Nixon campaign, who's the one who starts to package Nixon and says, we got to just appeal to people's emotions. We don't need to appeal to their brains because that is complicated. It's much easier just to go for emotions. All right. So the Fox News Channel, what that manages to do is it manages to continue to move rightward voters, and they do that really deliberately. The idea that this is a reality and that other stations need to cover this reality or they're not being fair and balanced. And this helps to do something that a thinker for the Mackinac Institute, a right-wing think tank, says, a guy named Thomas Overton says, this is how you change the political conversation. You keep moving it far. You keep saying more and more extreme things, and that'll move the center farther and farther and farther. And that's precisely what happened. The Overton window moved further and further to the right. All right, so where do we go from there? So, so this is great. You've got this narrative. People are starting to believe this narrative, but this movement of the money upward is still hurting a lot of people. So a lot of people who are not included in this lovely narrative of the cowboy protecting his family, that would be women of color, women of color, women, people of color, who are actively being hurt in this moment, they're not convinced. So what do? How do you protect these gains? What do? You manipulate the system. And this is, again, ideological. And this is so important right at this very moment, because of course you have things like just last week when California went to, I'm sorry, I try to keep these historical, but this is such a look forward. When Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom in California said that there would be mail-in voting for Californians, if you remember, President Trump said that's illegal. That's, this is these are illegitimate votes. Those votes shouldn't be counted. Well, step back from that a minute. If we're a democracy, shouldn't everyone's vote be counted? Like that's just a weird thing to say, that because they're voting by mail, they shouldn't be included. What is behind that? Well, what's behind that is that if in fact the movement conservatives were right, and that women and people of color being included in the body politic were dangerous to democracy because they're going to demand programs that cost tax dollars and create the need for business regulation, then they really shouldn't vote. If they're dangerous to democracy, if they're dangerous to America, they shouldn't have a voice. So how do we get there? The obvious thing to do, first of all, is to stop Democrats from being elected, and they think they've nailed that, right? They think that after George H.W. Bush, after the first term, that it's pretty clear that trickle down is working in their minds, and that nobody's going to elect a Democrat again. So they're blindsided when Clinton is elected in 1992, and they set out from the beginning to undermine his administration, to the point that, for example, no Republican will sign on to his budget. It's, the bipartisan attempt to create compromise is gone, because a movement conservative can't compromise. You can't raise taxes. You can't allow for there to be any kind of regulation of the economy, because ideologically that destroys your position. It's an ideological position. You can't do that. It's a purity test. And again, ideologically, they're right. So they of course, are trying desperately to destroy the Clinton presidency. And obviously that becomes, from the very beginning, they're looking for a scandal to bring down Clinton. And he gives them one. Finally, there's an inquiry into the Whitewater scandal. Whitewater was all about the fact that the Clintons invested in a land company in Arkansas, and after they had lost the money and had removed themselves from that company, the company went on to do shady land deals. That Whitewater investigation, Clinton says, sure, go ahead and investigate it, but the Republicans remove the person he wants to put in charge of it, and a moderate, and instead put in charge an extremist, and that extremist goes on. This Ken Starr, he goes on to dig through everything in the Arkansas history of the Clintons, and eventually to turn up Paula Jones, a woman who claims that she has been sexually harassed by Clinton. That when she turned down his sexual advances, she lost her job. She actually loses that case. Because she didn't lose her job. I mean, I don't think there was a lot of doubt that he did make suggestions to her, but she didn't. There was no cost to her for that. She didn't lose her job, so she loses the case. But in the process of the Paula Jones case, Clinton has to give a deposition. This is why this week, oh my God, what a week! Tuesday's Supreme Court hearing was so interesting, because Trump is arguing that he can't be asked to do anything. And of course, the Supreme Court decided unanimously that Clinton did have to give a deposition in the Paula Jones case. In that deposition, he lied about a sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky. That's where the Monica Lewinsky scandal comes from. The movement conservatives, the Republican Party, think they've got Clinton. They impeach him. They expect that he is going to be convicted. And of course, his popularity only goes up during this, which just horrifies the movement conservatives. In fact, Gingrich was so convinced that this would kill off Clinton that he expected that he would be able to get rid of the Democrats altogether in the midterm elections of 1998. In fact, the Democrats actually pick up House seats and held even in the Senate, which had not happened in an American election since 1822. Americans really did not like that Clinton impeachment. Clinton had a 70% popularity when it was over. All right, so if that's the case, if people are going to elect Democrats, what are you going to do? You better get rid of some of the electorate. And party operatives had begun talking about getting rid of American Democratic voters as early as 1986 to protect that tax cut. And they put in writing that they wanted to look at ballot integrity. But they put in writing that what they thought this would do is it would cut black voters out of the electorate, and therefore they would have a much better in crucial districts, that they would have a much better chance of winning in those districts if under ballot integrity you could throw black people off the rolls. When Democrats get in power under Clinton, they put in place the motor voter law of 1993, and that, of course, expands voting by letting you register to vote in motor vehicle offices, but also in welfare offices and in jobs offices and federal offices and state government offices. And when that happens, Republicans insist that this is an attempt to enroll, as they say, core Democratic constituencies. These are the lazy people, the people in welfare offices. So they're against it. And on the heels of that, Republicans begin to talk about voter fraud and cleaning up the rolls, the voting rolls. Now, I just got to emphasize here, actual voter fraud is virtually non-existent. Okay, it's virtually non-existent. If you have any doubts about that, go to the Brennan Center out of New York University. They have a whole team of people who do nothing but look for cases of voter fraud. And they simply, I don't have time to explain that right now, but this is a created scandal, all right? So what happens is by 1994, Republicans are beginning to argue that when Democrats win, it's because of voter fraud. And they don't really have any evidence of that. But in 1996, both in the House and in the Senate, Republicans launch investigations of campaigns from that year in which they claim that Democrats have won only because of voter fraud. And they keep those investigations open for a year. In the end, they don't find anything, but they say they couldn't find anything because it was too well hidden. But what they've done is they have seeded the popular conversation with the idea that Democrats are cheating, that there is such a thing as voter fraud. There isn't, but they have made people believe there is. And this is why I study the relationship between ideas and reality. The reality is there is no such thing as voter fraud, and that Republicans are using that to weaponize that to get rid of Democratic voters. But people believe by now that there must be voter fraud because your Congress people are out there in front of the media talking about it. So what happens is that in 1998, in Florida, after a really messy election in Miami that did not incidentally involve Democrats, the Florida legislature passes a voter ID Act, which removes up to about 100,000 voters from the Florida system through these voter purges. Why does this matter? Because this is in place right before the 2000 election. And the 2000 election, as you may remember, comes down to a little over 300 votes in Florida, contested between the Democrat Al Gore and the Republican George W. Bush. In that process of recounting, so people look at the recount, but the real scandal is what happened before the recount, the purging of so many Democratic voters, and of course the ballot, that infamous butterfly ballot, which siphoned off votes for Democrat Al Gore and who was on the wrong side of the ballot, and gave them instead to Pat Buchanan. I'm sorry, Gore was here, Buchanan, no, Gore was here, Buchanan was here. So the scandal there was less about those 300 votes, or 317, I think it was, than it was about what happened beforehand. But in the process of recounting those votes, if you remember, there was a riot of people who came down and disrupted the process of contesting those votes. It was known as the Brooks Brothers riot. The person in charge of the Brooks Brothers riot was, honest to God, Roger Stone. They're all the same people. That, of course, means the Supreme Court steps in, and the Supreme Court then decides Bush v. Gore, and a deeply problematic Supreme Court decision. Sandra Day O'Connor later said she thought it was a deeply problematic decision, not least because we do, in fact, in America, have a system for what to do when the Electoral College is a hung college. It's in the Constitution, and we could have resorted to that, as we have in the past, but we didn't. Nonetheless, this idea of voter fraud has gotten into the American lexicon, and it's one the Republicans have been able to weaponize most dramatically after 2013, when in the Shelby County v. Holder decision, the Supreme Court, now dominated by Republicans, thanks to George W. Bush, is able to, the Supreme Court guts the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I don't really have time to explain how they do that, but immediately after the gutting of that law that is supposed to protect minority voting, a number of states immediately begin restricting the vote through voter ID laws and a number of other ways of making sure voters don't vote. So they manipulate the government by manipulating their voters. They also manipulate it by gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the process by which parties choose their voters rather than having the voters choose parties, if you will. And the way that's done is every 10 years after a U.S. census, a state legislature decides how the congressional delegations are going, or districts are going to be broken up in their states. So right before the 2010 election, the Republican Party deliberately launched something called Operation Red Map, Republican Redistricting Majority Project. And what they did is they poured money into legislative districts in the states so that they would control those state legislatures in New York, Wisconsin, Kansas, for example, and they would be in charge of redistricting. And that worked so well that, in fact, after the 2010 election, Republicans redistricted Florida, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, and Michigan, as well as smaller states. And what that meant was, for example, in the 2012 election, Democrats won the White House, they won the Senate easily, they won a majority of 1.4 million votes for the House candidates, and yet the Republicans had a 33-seat majority in the House of Representatives. And that's even more extreme in some of the states, like Wisconsin, for example. It's virtually impossible now for a Democrat, for there to be a Democratic House in Wisconsin because of that gerrymandering. All right, so the other thing, what this does is it means, in a way, it really doesn't matter if the Democrats win or not, because they've managed to lock up the machinery of government. And then finally, the other way that you can lock up the machinery of government that the Republicans have really weaponized dramatically since Reagan is through the courts. And this was quite deliberate on the part of Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, Edwin Meese, who deliberately started politicizing the Department of Justice, in which he claimed that he was going to pick judges in such a way that they could, quote, institutionalize the Reagan Revolution so it can't be set aside no matter what happens in future elections. And Reagan then went ahead and appointed more judges than any other president in history, including 3 Supreme Court justices and 1 Chief Justice. And then, of course, you had that rightward swing continue under George W. Bush, even though he was not elected by a majority of the people. He gave us 2 more Supreme Court judges, and including a Chief Justice. And then, of course, finally, you had Mitch McConnell stopping Obama from Democratic President Barack Obama from nominating judges, including a Supreme Court judge, by the unprecedented step of simply refusing to hear hear that case, hear that nomination. And then finally, of course, now we have Donald Trump putting in place judges at such a rate that McConnell actually, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has actually brought the Senate back into session despite the coronavirus in order to keep on pushing through federal judges. And this is of course why we're in the crisis we're in at this very moment. All right, so where does this all take us today? It takes us to the larger question of how you manipulate the public, how you manipulate voters. And what I tried to set out here was the idea that from the 1980s to the present, you have a group of people who are deliberately putting in place legislation that is giving them everything, moving all the money upward. And this is not negotiable. This is not, there's not a chart you can produce that doesn't show that this is exactly what's happened since 1981 in America. So they're doing all this, but how do they sell it? They sell it with this idea that taps into the very heart of American equality and freedom, the idea that you should have control of your own life. But they tap into that in such a way that they weaponize Americans' sexism and racism to say, you can't have those things if these other people get them. And that was what was so powerful in the 1980s and the 1990s. And when even that didn't work, they changed our democratic system. And that, to me, right now is where we are. That's what's on the table in this moment. And that is why I ultimately wrote this book about how oligarchs are threatening American democracy. I know I went a little bit over today. I'm sorry about that, but it's so much terrific stuff. Next week, I will pick up the present, if you will. And the week after that, I promised you I'd do at least one more on how I wrote this book and what the writing of a book looks like. But next week, let's pick up what the present looks like. And just a reminder, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, and I am loosely following when I talk about this, although there aren't so many stories in the book that I just came out with last month called How the South Won the Civil War. Obviously, I'm arguing that the ideology, the hierarchical ideology of the Confederates has retaken American society through the system that I outlined today. All right, so the book is How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. I hope you found this interesting. I, as you can tell, am fascinated by it, and I wish I could do it forever because there's so many good stories I haven't been able to tell you. But in any case, if you did like it, I'll see you next week. And thank you for tuning into this. Take care.